All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. On this channel, I've always kind of wanted to do kind of an upload on this particular subject, but I wasn't exactly sure how to go about it because I find that a lot of people are fascinated with Adolf Hitler for a variety of reasons. And on this, channel we do the Occult Mondays segment, and I've done a handful of uploads just about the entire concept of evil, and we also did, like about evil and how people kind of become the so-called cult leaders. But Adolf Hitler is more than just a quote-unquote cult leader. He is, of course, someone who actually affected the entirety of the world. He was a much larger historical figure. How do we actually get to somebody like Adolf Hitler? Well, I have a few sort of hypotheses that I'm kind of would hopefully like to discuss in this particular upload. But I would also say that the kind of trigger point, the motivation for this was I was recently watching the documentary Hitler's Family that actually talked about some of the sort of other people that were connected to Adolf Hitler, and I even made a comment that to one of my family members that we don't ever really get to hear too much about Hitler's family, like his brother, his sister, his cousins. We don't get to hear too much about them. And then, my sister actually pointed out to me that, yes, we talk a lot about Ava Braun. Yes, we mention her, but I was like, yeah, but we don't really seem to mention his sister, Paula Wolf, who was actually, born Paula Hitler. But of course, because of the infamous nature of her brother, changed her name from Paula Hitler to Paula Wolf. And then, well, you get the idea. Now, it's like during this particular film, they brought up a few things, and they brought up sort of two major points that I would like to draw attention to. The first is that Hitler's family had a lot of mental illness, even like he had family members that had schizophrenia. There was just a lot of unstable emotion in Hitler's family. And why would I bring this up? Well, for a while, I mean, I wanted to make an upload just to discuss the possibility that Adolf Hitler was just a sort of mentally deranged individual. I am not a historian. I mean, I'm not a World War II expert like some people who can rattle off details about nearly every major historical figure associated with World War II. Instead, like, as just sort of kind of an outside observer, I would say that one of the sort of motivations that I had to sort of start thinking this way was back when I was in grad school, I attended, the presentations for people who were there. Someone's doing their sort of, not exactly a thesis presentation, but, like a presentation on their upcoming work about what they're hoping to be working on. We had a little kind of colloquium like that at my university. And one guy was doing this on Adolf Hitler. And what he wanted to argue is that there actually is a lot of footage from the director Leni Riefenstahl, The Triumph of the Will. Leni Riefenstahl actually had a lot of footage of Adolf Hitler where he is just freaking out. He is just kind of going berserk. He's just like talking to himself at the Olympics, like he's just sitting in a box and just going crazy for no particular reason, and everyone's just ignoring it. And this guy was trying to come up with the sort of theory that Adolf Hitler was very mentally deranged, but a lot of those things were edited out, and they did not want the general public to know about Hitler's mental state. And even going back to one of the first films I ever saw about Hitler, it was actually a program on the History Channel. Shouldn't exactly call it a film, but they argued that they believed that Hitler had Parkinson's, and Parkinson's also, contributed to not only his mental state, but also his judgment making, most specifically his judgment making. And that's why Germany and Russia got into some major conflict, because Adolf Hitler just thought that he was going to die. But one of the reasons why I thought this would be an interesting upload for BBOR is that when we have somebody like Adolf Hitler, I was having a conversation about him recently with a historian, and I was just asking him the question, about what did Hitler actually believe? Because when I listen to people on the news media, and when I listen to people online, there's just this enormous game to play ownership of Adolf Hitler. They want to be like, no, he belongs to you, he doesn't belong to us. And that's exactly what people do. I mean, they want to be like, Hitler was a Catholic, Catholics are bad. Or the other side would be like, Hitler was an atheist, atheists are bad. Or people would be like, Hitler was a Nazi and Nazis were socialists, socialists are bad. And then they would say, no, Hitler was a right winger, so right wingers are bad. Like, it's just blame game, and it can be done in any sort of a variety of ways. And I asked that question to a historian, and what he said was, well, actually, with any major historical figure, like a president, a leader of a country, a monarch, whatever sort of major historical figure you would have, it's actually just a continuum of ideas that come together, or we shouldn't use continuum. The better word would be sort of a culmination of different ideas that get pushed together, and they change over time. I mean, there's so many things that would go on when, like, we're talking about the entirety of culture and history of the planet Earth, all coming together at once during this particular time. And ideas evolve, and concepts can change. And this is a very, very good example of it. Just like the stuff that Adolf Hitler talked about is, of course, very rarely seen at any of our mainstream things in the American political system today. It definitely exists, in the more outlying groups like the marches on Charlottesville. But, to say that Hitler was a socialist or that Hitler is a right-winger the same way that someone in the Republican Party would be a right-winger is totally inaccurate. What I really was hoping to try and find out more about, though, was I asked that question because I wanted to know what Hitler believed. And the hypothesis that I was kind of in agreement with, which this gentleman put forward during his thesis presentation, was just that Adolf Hitler was a mentally deranged individual, and he was somebody who was kind of, well, he didn't have it all together. He was able to be very articulate, and we have seen this countless times across a variety of true crime cases. Ted Bundy was a very articulate individual. Even the judge at his trial remarked about how, it's like he just thought that it was a shame that this well-spoken, articulate, well-dressed man ended up in such a terrible place. Elliot Rodger as well wrote, some articulate things in his manifesto, which he called the profound statements and stuff. Like, people can compose sentences, and people can be very articulate but still being batshit crazy. And yes, you might be thinking Ted Bundy, Elliot Rodger, you shouldn't compare them to Adolf Hitler. Yeah, absolutely not. Just giving some examples of people who were mentally deranged but still able to articulate. When it comes to, though, somebody of the magnitude of Adolf Hitler, it's very difficult to find anyone else from the Western world that would actually reach his level. He might be referred to as the most evil person in all of history. I mean, that's a totally subjective statement. It also depends on what you mean by evil. But I wanted to explore this subject more and more because I guess it's always stayed with me, the possibility that, Hitler is not a genuine believer in anything. And there's a reason for that. The other thing that we would sort of talk and go into this, well, his sister, Paula Wolf, appeared in this documentary, Hitler's Family. And she even talked a little bit about, and this is, they have some video clips of her, but they also have, stories about people who knew her. I mean, like, when I should say she appeared, yes, there is, some video footage of her, but they're actually, to be honest, someone was reading off words that she had written about Adolf in the past. And what they said about Hitler when he was younger was, he was always the leader. It's like he was always, the dominant figure when they would be playing games as a child and stuff. And you can't really always just imagine Adolf Hitler, as a little boy playing a game with his sister. But it was always like he was the dominant one. He was the leader in everything. He was just a controlling, dominant figure probably all of his life. And he probably didn't respond well to a lot of things. Probably didn't respond well to not making it in art school, because he was too different. And a lot of those things probably would affect his kind of mental state to the point where he just wouldn't have any boundaries. I mean, we're just some of that, I admit, is probably a bit too much with the guesswork. But the thing with Hitler is we have two big things going on. For starters, I do believe that he was a very deranged, sort of like a high functioning, but crazy individual, for lack of a better word. I wish I had a better word because, like, I can't diagnose him right now. What any sort of mental condition he would have had. Perhaps narcissistic, like in the narcissistic personality disorder sense. But once again, can't really say anything about that 100%. But I would say that I believe he's a mentally deranged individual, and also just the dominant nature is more of a personality trait. We're talking about disagreeableness and all of those things. Last night, I was watching the film The Stanford Prison Experiment on Netflix, and this is one that I thought really highlighted something just about the Phillips and Bardo prison experiment from the 1970s, where they had a group of individuals had to pretend to be prisoners, and a group of individuals had to pretend to be guards. And like about how they just immediately fell into the roles, about how they immediately wanted to become more dominant than the other group, and it was all about personality traits. And they were just like, this person's trying to become the dominant leader of the prisoners, this person's trying to become the more dominant leader of not only the guards but also everyone. And that, just really reminded me of these things about Adolf Hitler, because it's like just hearing someone who knew him firsthand put out this sort of information that he always would try to be the leader of the group, he would always try to be the dominant figure. Personality traits really are just running so deep in humanity, and there probably is something associated with genetics and associated with neurology and brain functioning about why Adolf Hitler was the way he was, about why his rise to power is not a fluke, but rather just kind of, once again, the course of human psychology and action, being very dominant, being very disagreeable, always, fighting his way to the top, being very assertive. And that's a very big one, being assertive, because it sounds like he was a very assertive individual as a child. It also seems like he was someone who had absolutely no recognition for social boundaries. I mean, for a while he worked as a far-right agitator or something who would come up with, well, sort of, slogans against the opposing side. It's a very, very, well, it sounds quite simple when you think about it in some ways, but I would also say, though, that I don't think Adolf Hitler was just somebody who had an assertive personality. He wasn't just someone who wanted to be the boss. I do believe that there was an actual element of mental derangement, in the sense that he probably had some undiagnosed mental disorder, or at the very least, he didn't have any sort of widely publicized, people did not publicize his kind of poor mental health state. He was obviously very high functioning if he was able to kind of rise to the level that he was. But at the same time, that was all supported by very destructive and borderline psychotic, if not actually psychotic, ways of brain functioning. So I would really have to once again put forward these two large things. The first really is just that Adolf Hitler was a mentally deranged individual, and the second thing is that his personality traits were wired toward things like dominance and assertiveness, which kind of gave you the Adolf Hitler that we know today. Is some people call him the most evil man in human history, and other people kind of view him as a misunderstood historical figure, or some other people are just like, it's like, it's also the time period in which any of these leaders live in, whether it's the President of the United States, whether it's Adolf Hitler, whether it's any king of any country from any of the dynasties of the past. It's sort of like what happens is, the time period in which somebody lives in also is one of the reasons why they rise to power. And when I was conversing with that historian, he sort of kind of said a different variant of that. It's just that all of the kind of thoughts and ways of the past come in, and the new leader can combine some different ways from different people, different influences from this way of thought and from this group of thinkers, and these things can come together and they can sort of create a new way that is kind of just a mismatch of all these different ways of thinking from the past. And you probably are going to find that. But a lot of people really think that Adolf Hitler wouldn't have risen to power if it hadn't been for the economic state in Germany post World War I, that he wouldn't have at least got to the level of where he was. However, we've talked about two big things that might challenge that. He was just an extremely dominant individual, and he also probably had some sort of mental derangement. On this channel, we've also talked about narcissism, sociopathy, psychopathy, where these traits, about how people with these traits, Dr. Ramani Daruvasula, who's now a YouTuber, she's like a doctor who does, a lot of YouTube work. She was promoting that many people who do have sociopathic traits are very likely to rise in not only dominance hierarchies, but also just to rise in the workplace on the corporate ladder, because they don't say no to things that are immoral. If somebody does something to if somebody wants them to do something that is destructive, unethical, or immoral, someone with sociopathic traits is just going to do it anyway, and they're not going to think twice, and they're not going to feel anything about it. Well, was that the way that Adolf Hitler was? I mean, I don't think anyone will have definitive answers to that this many years after his death. But what we can say is we know it's just a consistent amount of material in his life that is leading to these destructive behaviors. Dominance and assertiveness. Lots of mental illness in his family, even schizophrenia. I believe it was actually his cousin who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, as well as then you also have the possibility that he was diagnosed with Parkinson's later in life. So then you just had a bunch of negativity coming into one. Not to mention that, I mean, some people just push forward in life in very destructive ways. Some people just rise to the top in very destructive ways, and we sort of know them in our personal lives, like certain in school. I mean, it's that sort of those dominant and assertive traits in life that we were talking about. They definitely come out into action. Well, what do you think about anything that I've put forward? Do you think that Adolf Hitler was a mentally deranged individual? If you do, how could that be? Like, what do you think would be sort of wrong with him? And the next one is, do you think that personality traits are very big in someone's rise to power? And the reason I'm asking that way, think of it this way. Let's change that. Is it the leader, or is it the time period in which he or she lives? Which one is more important? The leader, them as a person, as an individual, versus the time period in which they live. Does it have to be both of those two things at the same time, or is one more important than the other when it comes to a particular individual's rise to power? Well, that's all for me now. Thank you for listening, and talk to you soon.